You know that feeling when you get something you've wanted for so long that it doesn't even feel real? That was me the day I first put the key into the lock of the Devereaux house. My hand was actually trembling a little. It was ridiculous. I'm Clara, by the way. At the time, I was working on my master's in historical architecture at Tulane, and this was the internship, the one everyone in the program would have killed for. A solo commission to survey and catalog a grade A, untouched, 19th century mansion in the heart of the Garden District, before a massive restoration project began. The gate groaned like an old man getting out of bed as I pushed it open. It was a humid New Orleans morning, the kind where the air feels like a warm, wet blanket you can't throw off. The grounds were overgrown, but in a romantic secret garden kind of way. Weeds choked the marble birdbath, and jasmine vines had woven themselves through the wrought iron fence, their sweet, heavy scent mixing with the smell of damp earth. But the house itself, my God, the house. It stood 3 stories tall, a grand, pale ghost of a thing with peeling white paint, dark green shutters that were mostly shut tight, and a sprawling front porch held up by these massive Corinthian columns. It wasn't just a building, it was a storybook illustration brought to life, a beautiful sleeping giant. Professor Albright, my supervisor, had just handed me the keys, a stack of original blueprints that felt as fragile as dried leaves, and a binder full of legal forms. His only instructions were, be meticulous, be respectful, and call me once a week. The place is all yours, Clara. Don't get lost. He'd chuckled at that last part. The front door was enormous, solid oak, with a tarnished brass knocker shaped like a heron. The key turned with a heavy, grinding clunk, and the door swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was the scent of a place sealed off from the world. Dry, papery dust, the faint, resinous perfume of old wood, and a chilly undercurrent of stone and stillness. It was the smell of time itself. I stepped inside and the door clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing in the sudden, profound silence. My sneakers felt sacrilegious on the checkered marble floor of the grand foyer. To my right, a colossal staircase with a dark, carved mahogany balustrade swept upwards into the shadows of the second floor. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streamed in from a huge arched window above the landing, illuminating the space in a hazy, ethereal glow. Everything was covered in a fine, uniform layer of gray dust, a delicate shroud that softened all the edges and preserved everything beneath it. It was like stepping into a photograph. For the first hour, I did nothing but walk. I didn't take a single note or picture. I just moved from room to room with my hands in my pockets, absorbing the feel of the place. The formal parlor with its towering fireplace and furniture still draped in white dust cloths, looking like a congregation of ghosts. The dining room, dominated by a table long enough to seat 20, with a chandelier so caked in grime and cobwebs it looked like some bizarre crystalline sea creature. The library, oh, the library! Floor-to-ceiling shelves, still packed with books whose leather spines were cracked and faded. I ran a finger down one, leaving a clean streak in the dust. The title was in French. Les Contemplations. It was perfect. The isolation wasn't a problem. It was a gift. No distractions, no colleagues to chat with. Just me, the house, and its secrets. It was a scholar's dream. I set up my base of operations in the living room, a slightly less formal space off the foyer. It had a nice set of French doors that opened onto a walled side garden, though they were bolted shut. I unpacked my gear onto a dusty but sturdy-looking coffee table, my digital camera, a portfolio of large-format paper, various pencils and charcoals, a laser measuring device, and my small digital audio recorder. I used the recorder as a sort of verbal notebook. It was faster than writing, and sometimes just talking through a problem or an observation helped me organize my thoughts. I clicked it on. Okay, log entry 1, June 12th, Clara Barton. First day at the Devereaux house. The scale of this place is just incredible. The foyer's ceiling has to be at least 20 feet. The millwork on the main staircase is hand-carved, looks like black walnut. I'm seeing a mix of Creole and Greek Revival influences, which is typical for the period, but the execution here is top tier. The silence is complete. All I can hear is the hum of the air conditioning unit I plugged in, and the sound of my own breathing. It's perfect. Time to get to work. First up, preliminary photos of the ground floor. I spent the next several hours in a state of pure, unadulterated flow. I moved with a focused purpose, my world shrinking to the details in front of me, the egg and dart molding along the ceiling, the intricate pattern of the parquet floors hiding beneath the dust, the way a small, colored glass pane in a side door threw a ruby-red patch of light onto the floor. I sketched the cornices, measured doorways, and took hundreds of photos. The house was quiet, a silent partner in my work. The only sounds were the soft scrape of my pencil on the heavy paper, the click of my camera's shutter, and the shuffle of my own feet. The silence felt productive, respectful. By late afternoon, the sun was slanting low through the grimy windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the rooms. My back ached and my fingers were smudged with charcoal. I realized I hadn't eaten or had anything to drink since breakfast. I had a thermos of hot water and some tea bags in my backpack. A cup of tea while I watched the last of the daylight seemed like a fitting reward. I made the tea in my own insulated mug, the steam rising in the cool, still air of the house. The living room was the coziest spot, and I walked over to the tall windows that looked out onto the front lawn. I used the sleeve of my jacket to wipe a clean circle on the dusty pane. The windowsill was wide and made of marble, cool to the touch. I placed my mug there, right in the center of the sill, so I could sit on a nearby ottoman and look out at the setting sun, painting the overgrown garden in hues of orange and purple. It was a beautiful, peaceful moment. I felt completely content. I remembered I'd left my primary sketchbook in the dining room when I was doing a quick study of the wainscoting. I didn't want it to get warped by the evening humidity. It would only take a second. I got up, left the living room, and walked through the wide archway into the grand dining room next door. The sketchbook was right where I'd left it, on the corner of the enormous table. I picked it up, tucked it under my arm, and turned back. I walked back into the living room, my mind already thinking about which sketch I wanted to refine later that evening at my apartment. I glanced toward the window, ready to pick up my tea, but the mug wasn't there. I stopped. The marble windowsill was empty. For a second, a flicker of genuine confusion, a sort of mental static, went through me. I was sure I had put it there. I could still feel the memory of the cool marble under the warm base of the mug. I looked around the floor, thinking maybe I'd knocked it over, but there was no spill, no broken ceramic, and then I saw it. It was sitting squarely in the middle of the large, low coffee table where I'd set up my gear. It was positioned perfectly, not askew, as if someone had deliberately placed it there. Steam was still faintly coiling from the lid. I stared at it for a full 10 seconds. My heart did a funny little flutter. The silence in the room suddenly felt different. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, watchful. Then, reason took over. A slow, tired smile spread across my face. "Clara, you idiot," I thought. "You're exhausted." Of course. I must have been on autopilot. I was probably thinking about my equipment, and I just put the mug down on the table with everything else, without even registering it. I'd been so absorbed, so focused all day, my brain was clearly starting to misfire. The memory of putting it on the windowsill felt vivid, but it must have been a phantom, a thought that I mistook for an action. It was the only explanation that made any sense. I chuckled to myself, shaking my head at my own absent-mindedness. I walked over to the table, picked up the mug, and the plastic was still warm. I took a sip. The tea was good. I sat down on the ottoman, just as I had planned, and looked out the window. The sun had sunk lower, and the light was fading fast. Later that evening, before packing up to leave, I made my final audio log for the day. I sat on the floor of the foyer, my back against the cool wall, surrounded by my packed bags. The house was a cavern of darkness now, except for the single work lamp I had illuminating my small circle of the marble floor. I pressed record. End of day 1 log. Made incredible progress. The house it's more than I could have hoped for. The craftsmanship is just breathtaking. I've got enough raw data from today to keep me busy with drafting for a week. Feeling good. Productive. I paused, chewing on my lip. Then, I decided to add it. It was funny, in a way. A sign of a good hard day's work. A little tired though, I said, and I could hear the smile in my own voice. I actually, for a second, completely lost track of where I put my tea. I could have sworn I set it on the windowsill, but it turned out I'd put it on the coffee table the whole time. Totally spaced out. I laughed softly. It was a small, slightly hollow sound in the vast, dark hall. I clicked the button to stop the recording, but before I did, I added one last thought, my voice quieter now, almost a whisper. I'm sure that's what happened. I'm just tired, I guess. A beat of silence hung in the air, a space that felt just a little too long. Yeah, just tired. Click. The recording stopped, and the immense total silence of the Devereaux house rushed back in to fill the void. The next morning, driving back to the house, I told myself I was being an idiot. You know how your brain can play tricks on you, especially when you're tired or in a new place. That's what I chalked it up to, the teacup thing. I replayed it in my head a dozen times on the drive down St. Charles Avenue, the streetcar rattling past me like a green and red dragon. I was overworked. I was dehydrated. I was in a massive, empty house for the first time. Of course my brain misfired. I probably picked up the mug to move it, got distracted by a thought about wainscoting, and put it on the coffee table without even creating a memory of the action. It was the only explanation that wasn't insane. And I am not an insane person, I'm a scholar. I deal in facts, in measurements, in solid, verifiable reality. So that was the mindset I forced myself into as I turned the key in that huge oak door for the second time. I was a professional. I had a job to do. Yesterday was just a fluke, a brain fart brought on by exhaustion. Today's plan was to tackle the second floor. The grand staircase beckoned, its dark wood seeming to drink the morning light. I felt a little prickle of unease as the door clicked shut behind me, plunging me back into that profound weighted silence. It felt different today. Yesterday it had been peaceful. Today it felt expectant. I shook my head, physically trying to dislodge the thought. "Get a grip, Clara," I muttered out loud, and my voice sounded small and thin in the cavernous foyer. I lugged my gear up the sweeping staircase, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the runner. The second floor was a long, wide hallway with a series of closed doors on either side. The air up here was even more still, hotter than downstairs. The dust was thicker. My job for the day was to do a preliminary survey of all the rooms, starting with the master suite at the front of the house, which sat directly above the main living room. But first, there was a smaller room I needed to get into. On my first day, when I did my initial walkthrough, I had systematically locked a few of the secondary bedrooms and studies. My thinking was practical: limit the number of open spaces to manage, to keep myself from getting overwhelmed. Focus on the primary areas first, then expand. One of these was a small bedroom on the west side of the house. I had the key on the large, antique brass ring Professor Albright had given me. I'd labeled it with a small piece of masking tape. 2W West Bedroom. I walked down the hall, the floorboards groaning softly under my weight. The door was just as I'd left it, a simple 6-panel wooden door, its white paint cracked like an old oil painting. The old-fashioned skeleton key slid into the tarnished brass keyhole. It was a bit stiff. I had to jiggle it, and then it turned with a loud, grating clunk that echoed down the hall. The sound was so jarring in the quiet that it made me jump. I took a breath, turned the old brass knob, and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as I remembered. Small, with a single tall window overlooking the overgrown side garden. It contained a simple iron bed frame, a small writing desk, and a large, dark wood wardrobe against the far wall. Everything, and I mean everything, was covered in that same uniform, undisturbed blanket of pale gray dust. It was like a tomb. The sunlight coming through the grimy window pane was thick with dancing motes, and it cast a pale rectangle of light across the wooden floor. It was perfect. A control group. A space I knew for a fact had been sealed since I arrived. I stepped inside, my mind already on the measurements I needed to take of the window frame. I took 2 steps toward the window, then stopped to pull my notepad and pencil from my satchel. As I did, I glanced down at the floor. And my heart stopped. No, it didn't stop. It did something worse. It gave a single, violent, painful-sounding thump against my ribs, and then seemed to fall into my stomach, a cold, heavy lump of dread. There, in the rectangle of sunlight, just inside the threshold of the door, was a footprint. It wasn't mine. My sneakers had a specific, crisscross pattern. This was the print of a boot, a work boot, by the looks of the heavy ridged tread. It was pressed clearly into the thickest part of the dust, a perfect, sharp-edged outline. And it was big, easily a man's size 10 or 11. Way bigger than my own shoes. I just stood there, frozen, staring at it. My whole carefully constructed, "I'm just tired" theory from the morning evaporated in a single, terrifying second. A teacup moving could be absent-mindedness. This could not. This was proof. My breathing got shallow. The air in the room suddenly felt thick and unbreathable, like I was trying to inhale wool. I didn't move. My eyes darted around the rest of the room. The dust on the bed frame, the desk, the windowsill, it was all perfectly smooth. Virgin territory, no other marks. No trail of footprints leading from the door to the wardrobe or to the window. There was just the one. A single solitary print as if a man had opened the door, stepped 1 foot inside, stood there for a moment, and then left. But that didn't make any sense. My mind started racing. desperately trying to find a logical explanation, a life raft in a sea of rising panic. Professor Albright. Maybe he had his own key. Maybe he'd come by yesterday after I left to check on things. But why? He trusted me with the entire project. He wasn't the type to micromanage, and he definitely would have called or texted. The owners then. But they lived in Boston. The real estate agent had made it very clear that they wouldn't be visiting until the initial survey was complete. A caretaker? No, the whole point of my job was that the house had been sealed and unstaffed for years. I backed out of the room slowly, as if the footprint was a venomous snake coiled on the floor. I pulled the door shut, my hand trembling so badly that the brass knob rattled. I didn't lock it. What was the point? Locks clearly didn't matter. I leaned my back against the wall in the hallway, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my sternum. The silence of the house was no longer a blank canvas. It was a presence. It was the silence of someone holding their breath. Every tiny creak of the old house settling, every distant rumble of traffic from outside, was now a potential threat. The feeling of being alone, which had been a comfort just yesterday, was now the source of a primal, gut-wrenching terror. I wasn't isolated. I was trapped. The house wasn't empty. I was just the only one who was supposed to be here. The rest of the day was a bust. I tried to work. I really did. I went into the master bedroom and tried to focus on sketching the fireplace mantel, but my hands were shaky. My charcoal lines were wobbly and uncertain. Every few minutes I'd stop, my head snapping up, certain I'd heard a floorboard creak in the hall, certain I'd seen a flicker of movement in the reflection of a dusty mirror. I was on edge, a plucked guitar string vibrating with anxiety. The vast, empty rooms no longer felt grand. They felt menacing, full of hiding places. The shadows in the corners weren't just dark, they were watching. I spent more time looking over my shoulder than looking at my sketchbook. I started locking doors behind me as I moved from room to room, a completely useless, paranoid ritual that did nothing to make me feel safer. Who was I locking them against? Someone who was apparently already inside. By 3 o'clock I couldn't take it anymore. The sun was still high, but the atmosphere inside the Devereaux house felt dark and suffocating. I packed my equipment with frantic, clumsy movements, dropping a pencil, fumbling with the latches on my portfolio case. I practically ran down the main staircase, my own footsteps echoing loudly in my ears, sounding like a desperate flight. I didn't stop until I had slammed the heavy front door shut behind me and was standing on the porch, blinking in the bright, humid daylight. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking too much to lock the door on the first try. The grinding clunk of the deadbolt sliding into place offered zero comfort. I got into my car, locked the doors, and just sat there for a full minute. Breathing heavily, my forehead pressed against the cool glass of the driver's side window. I reached for my audio recorder. I needed to document it. I needed to say it out loud to see if it sounded as crazy as it felt in my head. I pressed the record button. Log entry. June 13th. I started, and I was shocked at how my voice sounded. It wasn't the confident, academic tone from yesterday. It was thin, reedy, and trembling around the edges. Work on the second floor was interrupted. I paused, swallowing hard. I found something. In the west bedroom, the one I locked myself, I found a footprint in the dust. It wasn't mine. I described it in detail, the size, the tread, the way it was isolated. Then I started trying to reason it out, more for my own sanity than for the log. My voice was hurried, desperate. It has to be Professor Albright. It's the only thing that makes any sense. Or maybe one of the owner's family members has a key. Someone must have come in after I left yesterday. They must have. They came in, they checked a room, and they left. That's the only logical explanation. Even as I said it, the words felt hollow, like a lie I was trying to force myself to believe. It was a flimsy shield against a much darker possibility. I stopped talking, but I didn't stop the recording. The recorder captured the sound of my ragged breathing. The silence stretched on for a few seconds. Then, the flimsy shield shattered. The one, simple, undeniable fact that unwound my entire theory. A thought so chilling it felt like a shard of ice sliding down my spine. I leaned closer to the recorder, and when I spoke again, it was barely a whisper, a ghost of a sound filled with dawning horror. But the door was locked. Another pause. The truth settled, cold and heavy. The door was locked from the outside. With my key. I'm the one who just unlocked it. Click. I stopped the recording, and the only sound left was the frantic, terrified thumping of my own heart. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in my motel bed, staring at the textured ceiling, watching the headlights of passing cars paint long, slow stripes across the walls. Every creak of the building, every footstep in the hall outside made my heart leap into my throat. My brain was a feedback loop of raw fear, playing the image of that single, muddy bootprint over and over again. Then, it would play the sound of my own voice on the recorder, the dawning, whispered horror. The door was locked from the outside. With my key. It felt impossible. It felt insane. By the time the sun started to turn the sky a dirty gray, a different feeling had started to worm its way through the panic. Frustration. I was a scholar. A professional. I was letting this empty, creaking house spook me into abandoning the single greatest opportunity of my academic life. There had to be an explanation. There was always an explanation. That's the lie I told myself as I drove back down St. Charles Avenue. The logical part of my brain, the part that had gotten me into grad school, was desperately trying to regain control. Okay. Fact. There was a footprint. Fact. The door was locked. Hypothesis. What if there was another set of keys? A master set. Maybe a maintenance person. Someone the Boston owners hired for emergencies and forgot to tell me about. Maybe some guy came to check the pipes, saw my gear, realized someone was working there, and left without wanting to disturb me. He locked the door behind him out of habit. It was plausible. It was a thin, flimsy kind of plausible, but it was better than the alternative, which was that a ghost who knew how to use skeleton keys was wandering the halls. I decided I couldn't work on the second floor anymore. Not today. The thought of being in one of those closed-off rooms, with the memory of that footprint just down the hall, was unbearable. I needed to be somewhere open. Somewhere I could see everything. So I chose the grand staircase. It was, architecturally, the heart of the house. A massive, sweeping structure of dark, carved mahogany that curved up from the foyer in a magnificent spiral. It was also the most open, well-lit space in the entire building. Sunlight, thick with dust motes, poured in from the huge arched window on the landing. From the base of the stairs, I could see the front door, the entrance to the living room, and the dining room. No one could sneak up on me here. It felt safer. I set up my things on the wide, lower steps, my portfolio, my pencils, my thermos of coffee. Today's task was to sketch the balustrade, the series of vertical posts or balusters that support the handrail. In the Devereaux house, they weren't just simple posts. Each one was a unique, intricate carving. Twisting vines, blooming magnolias, strange, almost gargoyle-like faces hidden in the leaves. It was the kind of master-level craftsmanship that didn't exist anymore. It was breathtaking. And for a little while, it worked. I lost myself in the work. The familiar ritual of observing, measuring, and sketching was a comfort. My pencil moved across the paper, capturing the graceful curve of a wooden petal, the rough texture of a carved acanthus leaf. The house settled back into a peaceful silence around me, the weight of its history feeling more academic than menacing. I was just Clara again, the student, doing her job. The knot of fear in my stomach began to loosen. Maybe yesterday was just a fluke. Maybe my maintenance man theory was right. I was working on a particularly large section of the newel post, the big, thick post at the bottom of the staircase where the handrail begins. This one was a masterpiece, a thick column of wood carved into a swirling vortex of flowers and birds. I was trying to get the details of a hummingbird's wing just right when I noticed it. A flaw. Right in the center of a carved magnolia blossom, there was a tiny dark circle. It was no bigger than the end of a pencil eraser. At first I thought it was just a knot in the dark wood, or maybe a spot of rot, but it was too perfect, too round. It broke the swirling, organic pattern of the carving in a way that felt wrong, artificial. It was a tiny interruption in the flow of the art, and it bothered my detail-oriented brain. I leaned closer, squinting. The wood around the hole seemed just a little bit smoother than the surrounding area, but it was so subtle I thought I might be imagining it. I ran my finger over it. The edges were sharp, clean, not the soft, worn edges of old damage. It felt deliberate. A little flicker of the previous day's anxiety returned. I tried to dismiss it. It's an old house, full of strange repairs and modifications. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining the bright, white-blue beam directly into the tiny circle. I expected to see the solid, dark interior of the wood. Instead, the light just vanished. It didn't reflect back. It was like shining a light into a deep well. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed my eye right up to the post, blocking the ambient light with my hand. I angled my head, trying to see what the flashlight couldn't illuminate. And then I saw it. A glint. A tiny point of light on the other side. My blood went cold. It wasn't a knot, it wasn't rot. It was a hole. A hole drilled clean through the thickest part of the post. I stood up so fast my sketchbook tumbled down the steps with a series of soft thuds. My mind was racing, my heart hammering against my ribs again. A hole. Why would anyone drill a hole through the main newel post? It made no sense. It was vandalism against a piece of art. I stood there, staring at the post, my mind trying to work out the geometry of it, the trajectory. The hole was angled slightly upwards. From this position at the base of the stairs, what would it be pointing at? I slowly turned and looked up the sweeping curve of the staircase. My eyes followed the imaginary line from the newel post, up, across the open space of the foyer, to the second-floor landing. The line terminated on the far wall of the upstairs hallway, right at the spot directly opposite the door to the master bedroom. No, it couldn't be. I ran up the stairs, my sneakers slapping against the dusty runner. I didn't stop until I was standing on the second floor, my chest heaving. I turned around and walked to the wall the hole would be pointing at. It was just a plain wall, covered in the same faded, peeling floral wallpaper as the rest of the hall. I stood with my back against it, my eyes wide with a dawning, sickening understanding. From here you had a perfect, unobstructed view. You could see the entire master bedroom doorway. You could see anyone coming or going. But the hole wasn't on this side. It was on the other side. It wasn't for looking out of the bedroom, it was for looking in. My hands were trembling now. I walked into the master bedroom. The room was huge and empty, save for the massive 4-poster bed frame, stripped of its mattress, and the wardrobe against the wall. I walked to the wall that bordered the hallway. I knew where the hole should be. It would be at about eye level if you were sitting on the edge of the bed. I started scanning the wallpaper, my fingers tracing the faded pattern of roses and ivy. And then I found it. It was almost invisible. The hole on this side had been drilled through the dead center of a small dark red painted rosebud. A perfect camouflage. You would never, ever see it, unless you were looking for it. I put my eye to it. The world shrunk to a tiny, distorted circle. Through the long, dark tunnel of the hole, I could see the grand foyer below, the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light from the windows. I could see the front door. I could see the bottom of the sweeping staircase. I could see the exact spot where I had been sitting, sketching, not 10 minutes ago. Nausea rose in my throat, hot and acidic. He could have been there. The whole time. Watching me work. Watching me drink my coffee. Watching me mutter to myself. The thought was so violating it felt like a physical blow. But that wasn't the worst part. I pulled my head back from the wall, my mind reeling. I remembered something. Something the real estate agent had told me on the first day. This bedroom, it had been the only one that was still fully furnished until a few years ago. The owners had used it when they visited. The bed frame was here. But the mattress and my own gear, my sleeping bag and pillow from that very first night I considered staying over, had been piled right there. Right where the bed used to be. Where I would have slept. I knelt down, my knees cracking on the hardwood floor. I looked closely at the wallpaper around the tiny hole. And that's when I saw the final, damning detail. The dust. The thick, uniform blanket of gray dust that covered everything in this house was different here. In a small circle around the tiny rosebud, the dust was gone. Not just disturbed, wiped away. Clean. It wasn't an old hole. It was an old hole that was still in use. Someone had recently put their eye to this hole. Someone had cleaned the dust away so they could get a better view. The feeling of being watched, a vague paranoid prickle from the day before, now crashed over me with the force of a physical wave. It wasn't a feeling anymore. It was a fact. I wasn't just in a house with a trespasser. I was in a cage with an observer. My privacy hadn't just been breached. It had been methodically, patiently, and perversely stolen. Every moment I had been in this house I had been on display. When I was measuring the windows. When I was talking into my recorder. When I was sleeping. The thought made me want to vomit. I scrambled backwards on my hands and knees, away from the wall, as if it were radioactive. I got to my feet and stood in the middle of the empty room, wrapping my arms around myself tightly. The silence of the house pressed in again, but it was different now. It was the charged, heavy silence of a room where you know someone is hiding. I didn't dare turn my back on the wall with the hole. I felt it, even though I couldn't see it. A single, unblinking eye, fixed on me from the darkness of the hallway. I could feel its pressure on the back of my neck, a cold, focused point of attention. The vast emptiness of the room provided no comfort, only a clear stage for me to be seen. I was the only thing moving, the only thing alive, the sole focus of an unseen, unknown audience. And I had the sudden, horrifying certainty that I was not alone. Not at all. He was here. Right now. Somewhere on the other side of that wall, looking through. I went back to work the next day. I know that sounds insane, but you have to understand. Fear is an engine, but so is denial. And my denial was working overtime. The peephole was old, I told myself. A relic of some long-dead pervert, a piece of the house's sordid history. The clean spot around it? Maybe I did that myself. Maybe I smudged it with my finger when I first found it, I don't know. I was constructing a flimsy fortress of maybes to protect myself from the one glaring, horrible truth. I was being watched. So I worked. But something had changed. The work was no longer a joy. It was a chore, a mechanical process. I moved through the house with a new kind of awareness, a constant, low-grade hum of terror vibrating just beneath my skin. I never turned my back on a doorway for long. I found myself cataloging the sounds of the house, the groan of pipes, the whisper of wind through a loose window frame, not out of architectural curiosity, but so I could immediately identify any sound that didn't belong. The second floor was off-limits now. Completely. I told myself it was because I had finished my preliminary survey up there, which was a lie. The truth was, I couldn't stand being in the master bedroom, couldn't stand being near that wall with its single camouflaged eye. I focused my attention on the ground floor rooms, methodically moving from one to the next, sketching, measuring, speaking my observations into my recorder in a flat, emotionless voice. It was in the guest bedroom, a smaller chamber off the main hall with a view of the overgrown side garden, that I found the next thing. The room was mostly empty, save for a huge, dark mahogany wardrobe that stood against the far wall like a silent sentinel. It was a beautiful piece, likely original to the house, with intricate carvings that matched the grand staircase. My job was to document it. I measured its dimensions, sketched the floral patterns on its doors, and noted the tarnished brass handles. Then, I opened it. A wave of cold, musty air washed over me, the smell of cedar and 100 years of emptiness. The interior was bare. No forgotten clothes, no lost heirlooms. Just dust and shadows. There were 2 wide, deep drawers at the bottom. The first one I pulled on was stuck. I had to brace my foot against the wardrobe's base and tug with both hands. It finally gave way with a shuddering groan, scraping loudly in the quiet room. It was empty. Of course it was. I pulled open the second drawer. It slid out more easily. It was also empty. Except, in the very back corner, nestled in the thick gray dust, was a small, dark object. I frowned, leaning in for a closer look. It was a bobby pin, not an antique, silver filigree hairpin from the 1890s. It was a modern bobby pin, black, plastic-coated metal, with a little rubber tip on one end. The kind you can buy in a pack of 100 at any drugstore. It looked exactly like the ones I had in a dish on my own dresser back at my apartment. I stared at it. Just stared. My mind refused to process it for a second. It was so mundane, so out of place. It was a piece of the 21st century lying in a drawer that hadn't been opened in God knows how long. My carefully constructed fortress of maybes began to crumble. An old peephole was one thing. A misplaced footprint could, with a great stretch of the imagination, be explained away. But this? This was recent. This was physical proof. Someone else had been in this room. Someone had been at this wardrobe. Someone had pulled open this heavy, stuck drawer and left a piece of themselves behind. I didn't touch it. I slowly pushed the drawer shut, the sound echoing the finality I felt in my chest. I backed away from the wardrobe, a cold dread seeping into my bones. He wasn't just watching. He was moving through the house, living in it, almost, using it. And he was sloppy. Or maybe he wasn't sloppy, maybe he wanted me to find it. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. The next few days were a blur of heightened paranoia. The house was no longer a subject of study. It was a hostile environment. I developed a ritual. Each morning I would unlock the front door, step inside, and immediately lock it behind me. The heavy thunk of the deadbolt was the only thing that made me feel marginally safe. Then I would go through the entire ground floor, room by room, my heart pounding, looking for anything out of place, before I could even think about getting my tools out. I started locking the doors to the rooms I wasn't in. When I was in the living room, I locked the heavy pocket doors that led to the dining room. It was insane, a prisoner locking themselves in their own cell, but it was all I could do to maintain a shred of control. It was a Wednesday, I think. A hot, suffocatingly humid afternoon. I was working at the back of the house, in a small sunroom that was more glass than wall. The air was thick and still. I was sketching the intricate wrought iron window latches when I smelled it. Faint, at first. A thin, acrid scent drifting on the air. Cigarette smoke. I froze, pencil hovering over the page. I sniffed the air again. It was unmistakable. Fresh cigarette smoke. Not the stale, embedded smell of an old smoker's house, but the immediate, lingering scent of someone having just exhaled. My head snapped up and I scanned the overgrown backyard through the grimy panes of glass. Nothing. Just a riot of untamed ferns and creeping vines. A crumbling stone birdbath. No person, no flicker of movement. But the smell was there. It was inside the room with me. I crept over to the nearest window and tried to slide it open, but it was swollen shut with decades of humidity and paint. I moved to the back door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. It was an old French door, mostly glass. I could see the small stone patio just outside. It was empty. The smell was stronger here. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, stepping out into the oppressive heat. I looked left, right. Nothing. The yard was still. The only sound was the distant buzz of cicadas. He could have been standing right here, right on this patio, just outside the glass, watching me work. He could have finished a cigarette and simply stepped back into the shadows of the overgrown garden a moment before I looked up. The proximity of it, the sheer audacity, made my blood run cold. He wasn't hiding in the attic or the basement anymore. He was practically breathing down my neck. That night, I didn't even pretend to be okay. I practically ran from the house the moment the sun began to dip below the horizon, throwing my gear into the trunk of my car without any care. By Friday, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept properly all week. I was jumpy, irritable, and my work had suffered. I was making stupid mistakes. My sketches were sloppy. I knew I should quit. I should call my professor, call the owners in Boston, and tell them someone was living in their house. But what would I say? I found a bobby pin and I think I smelled smoke. They would think I was crazy, that I was just a spooked student who couldn't handle being alone in a big old house. I felt a foolish, childish paranoia warring with a very real, primal terror. I decided to give it one last push. It was late afternoon, and the light was starting to fade into that golden, dusty glow that made the house look both beautiful and melancholy. I just needed to finish one last section of sketches, the detailed millwork around the dining room fireplace. Then I could pack up for the weekend and try to get my head straight. I told myself I'd make a decision on Monday. I sat up on the floor, my back against the opposite wall to give myself a clear view of the room and the hallway beyond. I put one earbud in, playing a podcast at low volume, just enough to be a comforting murmur but not enough to drown out any other sounds. The other ear I left free, listening. Always listening. I was completely absorbed in capturing the delicate curve of a carved wooden leaf on the mantelpiece. The house was dead quiet. The podcast hosts were laughing about something. The pencil felt good in my hand. For a moment, a tiny, fleeting moment, it felt normal again. Then I heard it. It wasn't a groan of old wood settling. It wasn't the wind. It was a single, sharp, deliberate sound from directly above me. Creak. The sound of a single footstep. Of weight being placed on an old floorboard in the room right over my head. The master bedroom. Every muscle in my body went rigid. The pencil fell from my lifeless fingers and rolled across the dusty floor. The laughter from my earbuds suddenly sounded alien and obscene in the crushing silence that followed. The silence was absolute. Heavier, somehow, than the noise it had replaced. He knew I'd heard him. He had to know. Was he standing up there right now, perfectly still, listening to me listen for him? My breath hitched in my chest. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. This was it. This was the undeniable proof. No more rationalizations. No more maybes. He was here. Right now. A strangled sound escaped my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice a pathetic, wavering thing that the vast emptiness of the house swallowed whole. "Is someone there?" Silence. A deep, profound, and terrifying silence. It was an answer in itself. It was the answer of someone who doesn't want to be found. Of someone who is hiding. Panic, pure and unthinking. erupted in my chest like a supernova. I didn't think. I just moved. I scrambled to my feet, kicking over my sketchbook. I didn't care. I grabbed my purse and my car keys from the floor, my fingers fumbling, clumsy with adrenaline. I didn't grab my expensive surveying equipment. I didn't grab my portfolio. I just left it all there, scattered on the dining room floor. I ran. I bolted through the grand foyer, my sneakers slapping against the marble, the sound echoing madly in the twilight. I didn't look up the staircase. I didn't dare. I could feel his eyes on me from the darkness of the second-floor landing. I could feel him watching me flee. I wrenched the heavy front door open, stumbled out into the humid evening air and slammed it shut behind me. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so violently it took me 3 tries to get the key into the lock of my car door. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and jammed the key into the ignition. I didn't drive away. I couldn't. I just sat there, my chest heaving, staring at the dark, imposing facade of the Devereaux house. He was in there. He was walking through those rooms, my rooms, looking at my work, my things. My hand, slick with sweat, reached for my phone. I swiped until I found the voice memo app and hit record. I held the phone up to my mouth, the cool glass trembling against my lips. My voice, when it came out, was nothing but a ragged, breathless whisper. There's someone in the house. I heard him this time. He's upstairs. He's in there right now. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. The idea of being in my own apartment, another set of rooms with doors that could be opened, was unthinkable. I drove to a 24-hour diner about 5 towns over, a place with cracked vinyl booths and fluorescent lights that buzzed with a tired electric hum. I ordered a coffee I didn't drink and just sat there, a frantic, whispered recording on my phone, playing over and over in my head through a single earbud. There's someone in the house. He's upstairs. The words felt like they belonged to someone else, a character in a horror movie, not me, Clara, the architecture student who just wanted to measure cornices and document wood rot. The sun rose, painting the greasy diner window in shades of gray and pink, and with the light came a new, more practical kind of terror. My laser measure, my digital camera, my entire survey kit, all university property, worth thousands of dollars, was sitting on the dining room floor of that house. Scattered around it were my sketchbooks, my notes, my heart-on-a-page portfolio, all of it, just there. I couldn't leave it. Calling my professor, Dr. Albright, and telling him I'd abandoned his expensive equipment in a house because I heard a creak was professional suicide. He'd think I was flighty, unprofessional, maybe even unstable. He'd never recommend me for another internship again. My career, the one I had worked so hard for, would be hobbled before it even started. Fear is a powerful motivator, but so is the dread of public shame and failure. And so, I started to reason with myself, building a new, even flimsier fortress of denial. It was daylight now. Whoever was in there last night was probably a transient, a squatter, who found an empty house and used it for a night. He would have heard me running, heard me starting my car. Surely he'd be long gone by now. All I had to do was be brave for 5 minutes. Go in, grab my things and get out. Never look back. 5 minutes. It's amazing what you can convince yourself of when you're desperate. The drive back to the Garden District was the longest of my life. Every tree-lined street seemed to hold its breath. When I turned onto the house's block, my hands were slick on the steering wheel. The house stood there, just as it had every other day, a silent, Gothic giant against the bright blue sky. It looked almost benign in the morning light, like a sleeping animal that couldn't possibly be a threat. I parked across the street, my engine running, and just watched it for a full 10 minutes. No movement, no flickering lights, just the sun glinting off the grimy upper windows. Okay, Clara. 5 minutes. In and out. I got out of the car, the humid New Orleans air instantly clinging to me like a wet blanket. My purse felt pathetically light in my hand. I walked up the stone path, my steps feeling loud and clumsy. I reached into my bag for my keys, my fingers trembling as they closed around the cold metal. I looked at the massive front door, bracing myself to unlock it. But I didn't have to. The door was already ajar. Just a crack, maybe an inch. But it was enough. My blood didn't just run cold. It felt like it evaporated entirely, leaving me hollow and brittle. I knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that I had locked that door. I remembered the heavy, satisfying thunk of the deadbolt sliding into place when I'd fled. I had slammed it shut behind me. He had opened it. He wasn't a squatter who had left. He was still here. Or he had come back. Every instinct, every cell in my body, screamed at me to turn around, get back in my car, and just drive until I ran out of gas. Forget the equipment. Forget the career. Just live. But I was frozen. Staring at that dark slit of an opening, a gateway into the nightmare, and then I heard something. It wasn't a creak. It wasn't a footstep. It was a sound so mundane, so out of place, that it was 1,000 times more terrifying than a scream. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching. A dry, steady scritch, 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 like a pencil on thick, textured paper. It was the sound of someone working, the sound of someone drawing. And it was coming from upstairs. From the master bedroom. I should have run. I know, logically, that is the only sane thing a person would do. But a different, colder part of my brain took over. A strange, morbid curiosity wrapped in a thick blanket of pure terror. Who was he? What was he doing? The sound wasn't threatening in its nature, but its context was the most threatening thing I had ever experienced. It was the sound of ownership. Of someone who felt so comfortable, so at home, that they could sit in the morning light and sketch. My eyes darted around the porch. I needed something. Something to hold. To my right, propped against the wall, was a collection of old fireplace tools, left out there for some reason. They were rusted and grim, but they were solid. I crept over and my hand closed around the heaviest one, the poker. It was long, black iron, with a simple hook at the end. It was cold and real, and its weight in my hand was the only thing keeping me grounded to the earth. Holding the poker out in front of me like a sword, I pushed the front door open. It swung inward without a sound, revealing the grand foyer. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight cutting through the tall windows. My equipment was still right where I dropped it, scattered across the dining room floor, visible from the hall. My sketchbook lay open, a half-finished drawing of the mantelpiece facing up. The scratching sound from upstairs continued, unabated. Scritch! 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 He hadn't heard me. My heart was a frantic, trapped bird in my ribcage. I took a step inside, then another, my sneakers making no sound on the dusty marble. I moved past the dining room, past my abandoned work, and stood at the bottom of the grand staircase. My gaze traveled up into the shadowy darkness of the second-floor landing. The sound was clearer now. It was coming from the first door on the right. The master bedroom. The room with the peephole. I can't explain why I went up those stairs. There is no rational explanation for it. It was like being a passenger in my own body. One foot after the other, I ascended, gripping the iron poker so tightly my knuckles were white. The old wood of the stairs groaned under my weight. I froze. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was a physical presence. It pressed in on me, suffocating and total. He knew. He'd heard me. He was up there, in that room, waiting, listening. I stood paralyzed on the stairs for what felt like an eternity. But then, impossibly, the sound started again. Scritch, scritch, scritch. He had paused, listened, and then, deciding the sound was just the house settling, had gone back to his work. The sheer, unbelievable arrogance of it sent a jolt of something. Anger, maybe. Through my fear. I reached the top of the landing. The door to the master bedroom was slightly ajar, just like the front door had been. I could see a sliver of the room inside. The scratching was loud now. I crept forward, my back pressed against the hallway wall, until I was beside the doorway. I held my breath, slowly peering around the edge. He was there. A man was sitting on the floor, about 10 feet into the room, his back mostly to me. He was skinny, with lank, dark hair that hung over the collar of his worn gray sweatshirt. He was hunched over, completely absorbed, his hand moving with a focused intensity across a large sketchbook propped on his knees. He was the source of the sound. I watched him for a second, my mind refusing to process the scene. It was so bizarrely domestic. Then my eyes moved from him to the paper. From my angle, I could see the page he was working on. It was a charcoal drawing. It was incredibly detailed, expertly rendered. It was a drawing of me, not just a portrait. It was me, asleep in a bed. The very bed that was supposed to be in this room, though I'd never slept in it. He was adding shading to the pillow, his hand moving with that steady scratching rhythm. I could see other pages in the open book, filled with more drawings. There I was, standing at the window in the sunroom, my head tilted. There I was, sitting on the floor in the dining room, sketching the fireplace. An image of me pulling open the heavy drawer on that mahogany wardrobe. He had been documenting my every move. He hadn't just been watching. He had been studying me, capturing me. A small, choked gasp escaped my lips. The scratching stopped. He didn't tense up. He didn't startle. He just stopped. Then, in a movement that was unnervingly slow and deliberate, he lowered the piece of charcoal to the floor beside him. He lifted his head, and he began to turn. He turned his whole torso, as if on a slow-moving pivot, until he was facing me. His face was gaunt, pale, his features sharp, but his eyes were the most terrifying thing I have ever seen. They were completely empty, not angry, not surprised, not menacing, just blank, like two dark, empty windows on a vacant building. He looked at my face, at my wide, terrified eyes and my open mouth, with a strange, detached curiosity, as if he were an artist examining a new subject. He held my gaze for a moment, his own expression unchanging. Then, his lips parted, and he spoke. His voice was flat, calm, without a trace of any emotion at all. I was just missing this detail. The words broke the spell. The carefully constructed reality I had been clinging to shattered into a million pieces. This wasn't a squatter. This wasn't some random creep. This was a predator of a kind I couldn't comprehend. He wasn't just watching me, he was consuming me, turning my life, my fear, into his art. And my terror, right now, was his final, missing piece. A scream tore itself from my throat. It wasn't a call for help. It was a pure, animal sound of utter horror. I didn't think. My arm acted on its own, a reflex born of absolute panic. I hurled the heavy iron poker. I don't remember aiming or seeing where it went. I just threw it in his direction. And then I turned. And I ran. I didn't wait to see his reaction. I didn't care. I flew down the grand staircase, my feet barely touching the steps, my hands sliding on the banister to keep my balance. I half ran, half fell through the foyer, past my things, my life's work, which now seemed like meaningless trash. I hit the front door with my shoulder, shoving it open, and burst out into the shocking brightness of the Saturday morning. The humid air hit my face, but I couldn't breathe it in. I just kept running, down the stone path, across the manicured lawn, into the street. My mouth was open, but the sound didn't come out until I was halfway across the pavement. It was a raw, ragged wail that ripped through the quiet, humid air of the neighborhood. Across the street, a pair of men in overalls who had been tending to a neighbor's azalea bushes stopped what they were doing. Their weed whacker whined down into silence. They turned and just stared, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm, as I ran, screaming, and didn't dare to look back. I don't remember hitting the ground, but I must have, because my knees were raw and bleeding. The world was just the harsh, scraping sound of my own breath, and the frantic slap of my sneakers on the pavement. I was a wild animal, driven by nothing but a primal need to put distance between myself and that house, that room, that man with the empty eyes. The two men in overalls, the gardeners, just stood there, frozen. I probably looked like a scene from a movie, a mad woman bursting out of a quiet, respectable home. One of them, the older one with a gray mustache, fumbled for his phone. I saw his mouth form the words, "Call 911," to his partner, and that simple, real-world action somehow pierced through my panic. Help. That was a thing. A thing that existed. By the time the first police car arrived, its siren screaming a counterpoint to my own ragged sobs, I was huddled on the curb across the street, hugging my scraped knees. The gardeners had brought me a bottle of water I couldn't drink. My hands shook so badly the water sloshed over the side. When the officer, a woman with a calm, tired face, knelt in front of me, I couldn't form a coherent sentence. All that came out were fragments. Upstairs, in the bedroom, he was drawing, He was drawing me. It sounded insane. I knew how it sounded. Even in my terror, a small, sane part of my brain was screaming that they were going to think I was on drugs or having some kind of breakdown. But they took it seriously. Maybe it was the look on my face. Maybe it was the fact that the front door of a supposedly empty, historic mansion was swinging wide open. 2 more officers arrived, and they went in, guns drawn. The calm-faced officer stayed with me, asking quiet questions. What did he look like? Was I hurt? Did I live here? I just shook my head, my eyes glued to that open doorway. The wait was the worst part. Worse than the running, in a way. The silence that fell over the house after the police went inside was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The whole neighborhood seemed to be holding its breath. I kept expecting to hear a shout, a scuffle, a gunshot. Something. There was nothing, just the distant hum of traffic and the chirping of birds that didn't know anything was wrong. After what felt like a lifetime, maybe 10 minutes, one of the officers appeared in the doorway. He beckoned for his partner to come talk to me. She walked back across the street, her expression unreadable. "Ma'am," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "we've cleared the house. There's no one here." The world tilted. "No?" I whispered. "No, he was right there. On the floor. In the master bedroom. He was just there. We've checked every room, every closet, the attic, the basement. The back door is locked from the inside. All the windows on the ground floor are painted shut or bolted. There's no sign of forced entry, and no sign of anyone leaving in a hurry." I started to shake my head, a frantic, desperate denial. I saw it. I saw him. The doubt was already creeping into their eyes. Was I sure? Had I maybe seen a shadow? The old house playing tricks on my mind? No! My voice was sharper than I intended. He left something. A sketchbook. A big one. It was on the floor. The officer looked back at her partner, who gave a slight nod. She turned back to me. "Okay, we did find that. It was on the floor in the upstairs bedroom, just like you said." Vindication. It was a cold, bitter feeling, but it was something. I wasn't crazy. He was real. "See?" I said, my voice trembling. He was real. They took me to the station. I sat in a hard plastic chair in a small, windowless interview room that smelled of disinfectant and burnt coffee. It was a million miles away from the cloying, dusty air of the mansion. Here, under the buzzing fluorescent lights, the whole thing felt even more like a fever dream. An officer, an older man named Boudreau with kind, weary eyes, brought me a cup of coffee and sat down across from me. He let me just breathe for a few minutes before he started talking. He went over the story again, patiently. I told him everything, from the moved teacup to the footprint in the dust, the peephole, the smell of smoke, the creaking floorboards last night. As I listed them out loud, they sounded so small, so easy to dismiss. Each one a tiny thread of wrongness that had woven itself into a rope around my neck. "We couldn't find any fingerprints that didn't belong to you," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The poker you threw is there, on the floor, but there was no one to throw it at. It's like he was a ghost." "He wasn't a ghost," I said, my voice flat. "Ghosts don't hold charcoal. Ghosts don't draw." Officer Boudreau sighed and slid a large object across the table. It was the sketchbook. It was bound in cheap black cardboard, heavy and thick. "We need you to look through this. Tell us if you recognize the style, or if there's anything in here that can help us identify this man." My hands felt cold and numb as I reached for it. The cover was smudged with charcoal dust. Just touching it felt like a violation. I opened it. The first dozen pages were me. It was the most profoundly disturbing thing I have ever experienced. It wasn't just that he had drawn me. It was the intimacy of it. The precision. He had captured the exact way I chewed on the end of my pen when I was thinking. The way my hair fell over my eye when I leaned over my drafting table. There was a drawing of me in the sunroom, my face turned up to the light, a small, contented smile on my face for my first day there. He had captured my hope. There was another one of me standing on a stepladder, measuring the crown molding, my arms stretched up. He'd drawn the faint scar on my elbow from when I fell off my bike at age 12. How could he have seen that? How long had he been watching? Not just watching, studying. Dissecting me onto the page, I felt a wave of nausea. I flipped the pages faster, a sick, morbid need to see it all. There I was, asleep. It was the drawing he had been working on when I found him. It was a fiction. A fantasy he'd created, me asleep in the master bed. The detail was insane. The folds of the sheets, the texture of the pillowcase. And then I saw the last drawing he'd made of me. It was just a quick, frantic sketch. A face. My face. Mouth open in a silent scream, eyes wide with a terror that was so real, so immediate it felt like looking in a mirror. That was it. That was the detail he was missing. My complete and utter horror. I nearly closed the book right there, but my thumb caught on the edge of the next page. The paper felt different, thicker, a slightly different shade of cream. I turned it, and my heart stopped. It wasn't me. It was a young man, maybe my age. He had kind eyes and a mop of messy brown hair. In the first sketch, he was standing in the grand foyer of the mansion, looking up at the staircase with the exact same expression of awestruck excitement I'd had on my first day. He was holding a tape measure. He was an architect, a student, just like me. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly bone dry. I turned the page. There he was, sitting on the floor, sketching the same fireplace I had. Another page showed him laughing at something, his head thrown back. He looked so full of life. Then the tone of the drawings began to change. There was a sketch of him at the top of the stairs, looking down, his shoulders tense. Another showed him holding a phone to his ear, his face tight with anxiety. Then, a drawing of him in profile, peering out a window into the dark garden, a look of distinct fear on his face. The artist had captured the subtle shift from excitement to unease to outright panic. It was my own emotional journey, mirrored in the face of a stranger. "Wait a minute," Officer Boudreau said, leaning forward. He pointed a thick finger at a drawing of the young man smiling. "I know this kid. Not personally, but I remember the report. This has to be the fellow who was working in the house before you. The university reported him as a missing person for a day or two when he didn't show up. Then he called his parents, said he was quitting the internship and leaving town. Said he needed to deal with some personal stuff. Never gave a reason. That was, 3-4 months ago?" My blood ran cold. I couldn't tear my eyes from the drawings. I was looking at his last days, his last hours. I slowly, deliberately, turned to the final page dedicated to him. It wasn't as finished as the others. It was a rough, powerful charcoal sketch. He wasn't in any of the grand, sunlit rooms anymore. He was sitting on a simple wooden chair, in what was unmistakably the stone-walled basement of the mansion. The single bare bulb from the ceiling cast harsh shadows across his face. He was staring directly at the artist, and his eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open, his face a mask of pure, final, uncomprehending terror. The drawing was unfinished. The artist had started to shade the deep, oppressive darkness behind him, and then, for whatever reason, had just stopped. I made a sound, a small, choked gasp. I dropped the sketchbook. It hit the linoleum floor with a loud, flat slap that echoed in the silent room. He didn't quit. He didn't leave town for personal reasons. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't the next chapter in the book, I was the sequel. The man in the house wasn't just a stalker, he was a collector. He documented his subjects, from their first hopeful moment to their last, terrified one. And once he had captured that final detail, that perfect expression of horror, what then? The unfinished drawing of the boy in the cellar was the answer. It wasn't an artistic choice. It was an interruption. I had been his new project. I had escaped. I had run screaming out into the sunlight before he could finish my story, before he could sketch me in the basement. The boy before me hadn't been so lucky. I stared at Officer Boudreau, who was looking from my face to the open book on the floor, the truth slowly dawning on him too. The house was empty now. The predator had been spooked and had vanished back into the shadows he came from. But he was still out there. And he had his book. My section was incomplete. A story without an ending. An artist with unfinished work. The deep, dark silence of that old mansion on the corner wasn't emptiness. It was a grave. And the most terrifying thing of all was the question that began to burn in my mind. A question I knew would haunt me for the rest of my life. Where would he go to find a new subject?